Welcome back. In this presentation, we'll explore how social movements are shaped and communicated through strategic framing. We'll also look at how digital platforms, especially social media, are used to inspire action, influence public perception, and mobilize communities around a cause. As the world becomes increasingly connected, digital tools are empowering activists in ways never seen before. But social movements don't just appear overnight. They often arise from deep, sustained experiences of oppression. As you read through the chapter this week, you'll begin to recognize that the mechanics behind collective action and social and systematic forces will influence global movements. So, I've mentioned social movements, but we haven't properly defined the term. Political scientist Sidney Taro defines social movements as collective challenges by people with shared goals, taking sustained action against elites or authorities. Unlike political parties, social movements are more fluid, often fueled by people's desire for change and built around shared frustration and hope. And frankly, collective action is the heartbeat of a social movement. But here's the catch. Moncur Olson warned that when people act only in their self interest, it can lead to collective failure. If everyone waits for someone else to act, no action happens at all. To work together, people need a shared identity and a way to frame their struggles. These ideas were developed before the digital age, but today they still play out across hashtags and social feeds. Online activism has new tools, but the core principles certainly remain the same. Think about how we communicate today. Manuel Castells argues we've moved from one way mass media to many communication where everyone has a voice. Still, for a movement to be real, it has to show up in the world. Social media helps organize, but traditional media still plays a role in validating those efforts. And to be clear, social movements have always pushed boundaries, from marches to sit ins to today's online campaigns. And believe it or not, even the Declaration of Independence was a kind of social movement. Over time, labor and civil rights movements laid the foundation for today's digital activism. Now, before X, formerly Twitter, and TikTok, digital activism took shape in primitive forms like bulletin boards or email chains. In the 1990s, after a major data breach involving Lotus and Equifax, people organized online. This was one of the first digital social movements. It was messy for sure, grassroots indeed, but the beginning of something big. If you're old enough to remember Napster or AOL's instant messenger, you've seen the evolution of online community firsthand. These early platforms were more than entertainment, they were building blocks for digital community and later digital activism. Now that we've looked at the historical side of social movements, let's segue into a discussion about the key social movement theorists discussed in your text. So, scholars like Taro, Smelser, and Jenkins give us different lenses to view movements, from political opportunities to cultural framing and the role of formal organizations. Each piece helps explain why some movements succeed and others fizzled out. Now, in particular, Taro argued that sustainable movements need four factors. Smelser, on the other hand, contended that norm oriented movements drive change, And then Jenkins, he postulated that formal organization helps, but it's not essential. Ensure that you take some time to read upon these key theorists and their viewpoints this week. Now, for social movements to be successful, we must understand that passion isn't enough. Movements need strategy. Collective action happens when people connect their personal frustrations to a shared goal and seize the right opportunity. And while it might be spontaneous, behind every big movement is careful planning. Let's take a moment to widen our lens. Around the world, people continue to fight against deep rooted systems of oppression, but it's not always a steady forward march. Sometimes progress is temporary, and political openings can close just as fast as they appear. Activism creates change, but it can also trigger new forms of resistance or oppression. Political theorist Iris Marion Young gives us a helpful framework: five faces of oppression that show up in different ways around the globe. These aren't just personal experiences, they're built into the systems that govern how people live, work, and interact. Now, according to Young, the five phases of oppression are violence, exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, and cultural imperialism. According to Young, violence is the most visible and terrifying form of oppression. It doesn't just hurt, it sends a message that certain groups should live in fear. Think of hate crimes, assaults, and harassment. Many groups experience this kind of threat daily. On the other hand, exploitation happens when people do the work but don't get the reward. Think sweatshops or miners who rent equipment they can't afford. Under capitalism, this often creates rigid class systems that reinforce systematic inequality. At the same time, marginalization is about exclusion. It's when society sidelines whole groups, whether through laws, social norms, or neglect. This kind of exclusion has lifelong consequences. When it comes to powerlessness, this is when people feel like their voice doesn't matter. It shows up in voter suppression or when people opt out of civic life entirely. It's not always enforced by laws, sometimes it's psychological. As Freire puts it, the worst oppression is when people start believing they can't make a difference. Finally, cultural imperialism isn't always violent, but it's powerful. It's when one culture's values are treated as the default while others are belittled or erased. As a consequence, dominant groups shape what's seen as normal in society. So, why does this history matter to environmental activism? Because you can't fight for the planet without fighting for the people. Oppression determines who gets polluted neighborhoods, who's displaced by climate change, and who's ignored when they speak out. By understanding the theories behind social movements and seeing how oppression works globally, you'll be better equipped to build campaigns that are fair, inclusive, and effective. Digital tools give us the chance to change the narrative and elevate the voices that have been silenced for far too long.